Dan Yergin, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya.
Glad to be back with you, Hadley.
I want to ask you to walk me through where we are today in the energy transition.
I think the energy transition is in need of a major rethink, because I think a lot of the expectations, a lot of the planning, a lot of the spending was done really crystallized during COVID when demand was down and prices were down. And the consequence of that is that you had these straight lines, linear lines that went to 2050 net zero when almost half the world's emissions were not even covered by them. And I think there's been a lot of experience and a lot of lessons that are really driving a kind of new realism and pragmatism about the energy transition, not in the way that in a dominant fashion it's been talked about, particularly in Northwest Europe and in North America.
Essentially, the politicians are going to have to get real.
I think the politicians and I think people who think about energy transition in what has been reduced to very simple ways without realizing just how complex it is to change a $15+ trillion world economy in 25 years, when all the other energy transitions took a century or longer and were not really just energy transitions, they were also energy additions, because nothing else ever went away. And that's where we are today.
So when we talk about renewables, when we talk about solar and wind, adding capacity, essentially that didn't mean that fossil fuels were reduced.
No, Hadley, here's the way to just make it very simple. 2024, wind and solar were at the highest levels they ever were. In 2024, oil and coal were at the highest levels they were ever, and natural gas would have been there except for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which disrupted global gas markets.
So essentially what we're seeing is a world still very hungry for energy.
Yes, of all forms of energy. So wind and solar, of course, now well-established businesses. But if you still look at it, in the latest data we had in 2022, 81% of the world's energy was hydrocarbons. In 2023, it was 80.5%, a 0.5% change.
Okay, so those who are passionate about the green agenda would say, what are we doing wrong? How can we fix this?
Well, I think the number thing to step back and say, how challenging is it? What are you trying to do? And there are any number of challenges that we can do. I think the first step is really to be realistic about what's actually trying to do and what the constraints are.
And when we talk about constraints, part of this obviously is funding. How do you finance a transition when everything's getting more expensive?
Well, I think, so I think the first problem is scale, which is trying to change, as I said, this immense world economy in a very short period of time. And I look back, everybody was talking about energy transition, so I looked at, when I was writing the new map about other energy transitions, and you saw how long they took, and as I said, this energy addition. So it's just the scale of doing it in itself, because what you're trying to do is change the entire infrastructure, and then you get to the cost. And the numbers that were used for the Baku UN conference were numbers that would say about 5% of world GDP over a number of years has to be spent on that. Now, developing countries don't have 5% of their GDP. So that means 10% goes to developed countries. Well, let's look at England. Right now, the budget is struggling. That's one country to get it down. Europe now is going to be spending more money on defense and has to restore competitiveness. We'll have less money. And here in Washington,
they don't want to do it.
Well, they don't want to do it. And not only that, whether you're Democrats or Republicans, there's this problem of this $36.5 trillion debt where the interest payments are greater than defense spending. So, just the money's not there to do on scale. So that's just one of the, we should talk, there are a number of other of them that really have to be looked at as well.
Tell me this, how has energy dominance changed the game for this conversation?
Well, I think obviously we've had, like we saw it at our CERAWeek conference this year, like 180% change. Under the Biden administration, it was all of government for climate. Now it's energy dominance, the National Energy Dominance Council. And it's a recognition that the U.S. has this formidable position in the world as by far the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. It has become, people don't realize it, the scale exports of LNG have become a major export industry. It's twice the value of all of the Hollywood and television exports in the United States is LNG. But I do want to come back to the other obstacles to the energy transition, because I think if people understand them, they'll see that we really do need this rethink. The return of energy security, that was, people went to sleep about energy security until Ukraine. And then you had the Chancellor of Germany flying to Senegal and flying to Canada or going to Kazakhstan to get oil and gas even while doing that. But I think the biggest issue, and I know in the Gulf region, it's something that people are very aware of, is the split between the North and the South, developing nations who have other priorities. They need economic growth, they need improve health, they need to reduce poverty. So that's there. And then there are a couple of others that have emerged. You know, no one really was talking about critical minerals.
Even just a few years ago.
Yeah, just a few years ago. It really only sort of started to come on the agenda 21, 22. And then you saw, if you're really going to make this transition, you're going to need a lot more materials. An electric car uses 3 times as much copper as a conventional car. And then you see, we did this study at S&P Global. It takes 20 years to bring a new mine on. 20 years. So, well, wait a second. You need to double copper by 2035, but it's going to take another 10 years to bring it on. And then, of course, we get into geopolitics. China, the United States. China dominates exports of solar panels, but it most importantly dominates processing of minerals. And just now here in Washington, there's a big focus on the mineral issue, the critical mineral. We're going to see that energy dominance is going to be an envelope that also includes minerals. So all of that's out there too. And then the last thing that, boy, we saw this at the CERAWeek conference, which is electricity for AI. And in the United States, that means more natural gas going into it. So those are the kind of the parameters. Oh, and tariffs, trade turbulence, all those things. So the notion that you're just going to draw a line and get to net zero by 2035, that's why we say the energy transition is going to be multidimensional. It's going to unfold at different paces, in different regions, with different mixes of technology, and of critical importance, different priorities by different governments.
And in your mind, how prepared is the world for this reality?
I think the developing world is. We've done our Energy Asia conference, and we've certainly heard it there. We've heard it in Africa. We've heard it where, an African country has 1/20th the GDP of a European country being told by European institutions we won't finance a gas pipeline. I think obviously a change is going in Washington, a kind of monumental change. I think Europe is still is struggling with this, and you see it. I think you're going to see it a lot in the battles over the budget, and you're also going to see it in the rise of the populist parties.
No doubt. You mentioned CERAWeek. Obviously, this is your conference. It is the largest gathering, I imagine, of oil and gas CEOs globally.
Yes,
energy companies.
Yes, yeah, it was 10,000 people this year.
10,000 people. You're the Davos of the energy world.
Yes, I think we could say that.
It's true. What was the feeling on the ground? I mean, Donald Trump has been elected. The idea of energy dominance, it's all going to be fossil fuels here on out, but that isn't the case.
Well, I think it was, first of all, LNG was really front and center. That was very interesting to see the sense that the expectations for LNG are continuing to grow. And you heard, like, the Japanese now, for the first time in their energy strategy, are actually seeing more LNG. And a lot of that's related to AI. So that was the first thing. I think the second thing was the big tech companies were there. They've always come before, but they came because they provide services to the energy industry. Now that there was customers saying, how do we get our electricity? Certainly we were hearing about what energy dominance means, how it's going to be implemented, and the perspective of the new administration, not so new now. And that was, in fact, somebody from the Middle East said to me before CERAWeek, we want it to be more US-centric because we want to understand what's going on in a more granular sense. I think in terms of, we have a big technology part of it called the Agora, and there I think the takeaway was that in terms of renewable new technologies, you're going to have to depend much more on the market, not on government policy and not on incentives and from governments. And so how to be competitive. And I think we saw kind of renewables also shifting from climate to energy security as kind of their rationale.
How unhappy were oil producers at CERAWeek?
Unhappy? No, I wouldn't say unhappy. They were glad to see an administration that was coming in that is going to. The Biden administration had put on. Somebody did a calculation. In general, the Biden administration put on far more regulations across the economy than Obama and others. And to see that unwound was something. They were glad to see the pause on LNG coming to an end and the support for the energy industries. They really want permitting reform because you're not going to be able to provide the electricity if you don't have permitting reform. I think, like everybody else, they're wanting to see how the world economy is going to be changed by the tariff policy, the changes in relations. Obviously, we had a lot of Canadians there who were very, thought we had a really tight relationship with the U.S. What is our new relationship now?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of, I think, wanting to understand, and the sense that geopolitics matters in a different way for the energy industries now, including the growing tension between the United States and China.
No doubt. Talk to me about the fragility of the oil market specifically.
Well, I think right now oil markets have actually not been particularly fragile because you have all that overhang of capacity, primarily in the Gulf. I think it's been changed. I think the development of shale has added stability to the market as well as bringing significant new supplies on. But we also know that this market goes in cycles. And one of the key questions is, future investment. And something else I carried away is the sense that a lot of the producers were having the sense that shale is maturing. It's still going to grow, but it's not going to grow a million barrels a day. It's such a pace. And people were starting to say, we're going to have to do more exploration. We started hearing independent companies that have been overseas, out of the U.S. for 2 decades now, starting to go to different parts of the world. So I think there's a sense that not now, but you have to look 5 years down the road as to where the markets will be. And the other question, of course, is a question about demand, and in particular, what's happening in China.
Talk to me about the price, because oil in the low 70s doesn't do anyone any favors.
Well,
unless you're Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, I think the industry in the U.S. feels that they will do okay in the low 70s. They'll continue to invest, but they're worried about prices in the 60s. Or somebody from the administration, not a total insider, I think, talked about $50, and that will affect how people invest. So right now, I think there's a sense, we've kind of built our plans around lower prices. What a change, Hadley, from when people not so long ago were thinking $90, $100 a barrel. But I think I've just done a new epilogue for the prize. And instead of just trying to tell what happened, that's my book on the history of oil.
Your Pulitzer Prize-winning book.
My Pulitzer Prize-winning book, yes. What I've done is said, what are the lessons of this book that I worked on for so long and so many people have read? And I think one of the big lessons for me is, while there are hundreds of characters in that book, there are only 2 characters who really, 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 really matter. One is named supply and one is named demand. And so right now we have an oil market that has a lot of extra supply. But if we see, Iran squeezed out of the market, when the Trump administration talks about maximum pressure, that starts to change the balance. Of course, there are always geopolitical events that can affect markets. But I think right now, the outlook we have is for, low 70s Brent price for now, but we don't know how the world is going to be changed by this new switch from global trade to tariffs. On the way over, I was reading a paper by somebody who's in the Trump administration saying how good it will be for the economy. There are other economists who will say this is not going to be good at all. And, we will find out from experience. And one of the things I've learned from writing history, there's a very important law, which is called the law of unintended consequences.
Yes. Tell me this, how much trouble is Saudi Arabia in?
Oh, I don't.
With oil at 74.
I don't think Saudi Arabia is in trouble. I think Saudi Arabia is, will obviously adjust to lower prices, but it's in a formidable position. It is still, the single most important oil producer in the world. And I think the economy, adjustments will be made, but that's what you have to do in a cyclical industry. Timing will change of things, and projects will be managed differently. But I think, many other countries would like to be in the position of Saudi Arabia.
Tell me this, when you take a step back and look at this sort of within the historical context, you mentioned the prize. Is it difficult to foresee, as you say, unintended consequences, but is it difficult to see how this energy transition is going to be managed? Because we've been talking about this now for several years. The Gulf countries, all of them on board for the energy transition, moving as rapidly as possible. They've got the money to do it, they've got the technology, and they have the will. But when you take a step back and think about this, you've just said this is going to take a lot more money, a lot more time, and it's going to be much more complicated.
Right.
How messy?
Well, I think in a way, I think it's probably useful to think of, that's a very good question to think about in terms of energy addition. I mean, obviously people will continue to put emphasis on how they manage their emissions, but I think it also means that oil and gas are going to be around for a long time. In fact, I just saw a quote from the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, in which he said, let me level with you, oil and gas is going to be part of the mix for a long time.
And that's actually going out on a limb that other European politicians haven't managed to achieve.
Yeah, that just jumped out at me. And that shows me is that coming...
This is a man, by the way, who before he became prime minister told me at the World Economic Forum, no new drilling in the North Sea. He was very much as part of the green agenda, and that was just a couple of years ago.
Now he's come around in favor of it, at least to a degree, and I think they recognize that's the energy security issue.
Yes.
They're going to have a big problem with their electric supply unless they have adequate natural gas to back up this intermittent renewable energy system.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people haven't thought about. And so I don't know if messy is the right word, but complex. So the world will continue, natural gas demand will probably increase into the 2040s, but it will be additional because there'll be a lot more solar, there'll be wind, although offshore wind has run into problems about supply chains and costs and so forth. And there'll be new technologies. China is moving ahead very rapidly with electric cars. The United States is not moving ahead rapidly. Europe is in the middle. The question is, does the German automobile industry recover or survive? Do
you think there's a chance it could be over?
Well, I think that it's so important to the German economy, and with a new government, I think that will, just as we've seen the priority of Keith Starmer's statement, the Germans will. And we've seen the European Union at least talking about being competitive. And as you know, Hadley, when you talk to CEOs, they'll tell you why we're not competitive in Europe is because there is such a weight of regulation. That is the micromanagement that just forces investment in certain directions or sets targets that can't be achieved.
Yes.
And so if Europe, so verbally they're saying, oh, we're now in favor of competitiveness, and that was what the Draghi report did. But they have to get out of their way. They have to get away from the old way of doing things and the old way of thinking. The world has changed.
So are we in the midst of what could potentially be called the great recalibration on energy?
I think that's a very good term for it. It is recalibrating and reassessing and recognizing that those simple graphs that go to 2050 is not the way the world's going to go. Yes, people are moving ahead with hydrogen, but not in the way that was assumed. There's still the question, where is a real market for hydrogen? What are the costs? What are the infrastructure? Yeah. And by the way, if you're in Europe, yes, you want hydrogen, but you also now are going to have to spend a lot more in defense, and you want a competitive economy. And so, that word trade-offs really looms very large.
It's a tall order.
Yes.
Tell me this, when we talk about Russian energy, just from that perspective alone, how do you view the Russian economy today?
Well, I think at the beginning of, before and just when the war began, it was thought that these sanctions would be really penalize the economy. And it did for a while, but I think they've pivoted to a wartime economy. And I think
you didn't think those energy sanctions were going to do that much.
Well, I think,
and I didn't think that.
Yeah. At the time, I thought, well, these are stronger sanctions, and I also thought, are they putting the right sanctions on? But what's also turned out, I think, as a result of this, is Russia's basically become an economic dependency of China.
Yes, yes. And that's something I've asked them about on multiple occasions. It's not
they
something...
probably don't like that question.
I have that talent. But when you think about their ability to continue to wage war, do you think that the energy prices as they are today and potential sanctions are starting to bite?
Well, I think not. I think that the oil cap has not really had, it was a very interesting, important construction. It's reduced their revenue somewhat. But, now we're in just such a different mix where, what President Trump, clearly he says it, he uses that word, he wants a deal. And so at the one hand, there's talk lifting sanctions. On the other hand, there was talk just the other day of secondary sanctions and a new thing, secondary tariffs on Russian oil, because people know that's the revenue stream that keeps Russia at war. I think Putin his strategy is he doesn't care that maybe 800,000 Russians have been killed or wounded. He's determined to just wait it out and wait for the Ukrainians to run out of steam, for the support to become more fragmented. So he's playing a waiting game at great...
Whose time runs out first?
Well, let me say a waiting game at great human cost.
Yes, which doesn't seem to faze him.
Doesn't faze him at all. I mean, he's, I think one of the questions will always be, we will never know the answer, is how much did his isolation during COVID lead to this? Because if he'd been meeting prime ministers and presidents and CEOs instead of, as you know, where you had to wait 2 weeks in a hotel in Moscow.
I did.
Yeah, I know, you did, I know. That's why I mentioned it.
In isolation.
Yeah.
Well, it was either that or meet him across a very long table.
Yeah, yeah.
So I took the lesser of what seemed to be two evils.
And so he's with very few people, and one person's obsession can, really change the course of the world, and he's done that to a considerable degree.
When it comes to energy, the same question could be applied to Europe, because as Donald Trump has signaled, at least thus far, he's not interested in continuing to fund European defense. In your mind, how difficult is this going to be for Europe to foot the bill?
Yeah, I think it's that's where they're going to have to face the trade-offs. That's why, they're going to basically one of the big things is, okay, you've been putting money in energy transition, you're going to have to put more money, and you're going to have to get organized. And by the way, it's not a single nation, it's 27 countries plus Britain, for everybody to reorient their policies and to collaborate, not across as the United States state borders, but national borders. It's a big challenge, but I think it really seems that the Europeans are serious about this and realize now that they, have to do it. I mean, this has been called an obsession of Donald Trump, and that they're not paying their share.
Yes.
And and that applied to Canada too. And so they're I would say they're scrambling right now.
Yes, almost like the grasshopper that sang all summer.
I don't know that story.
Oh, well, it didn't end well for him.
Oh.
In my mind, when you take a step back and think about this with regards to Europe specifically, okay, they know they're in real trouble. Donald Trump has signaled that the United States is not going to be there for them necessarily. What do they do next? Because there's been a lot of talk over the years about a single market for energy. Is that, in your mind, feasible? Well,
I mean, there's a single market for natural gas. I don't know if that's what people point to more is a single market in terms of financial single markets and the integration of their markets to get to scale. I think that seems to be, as I understand, more on the agenda. And now they're going to have to do something, actually, to use your language, which we haven't talked about before, a single market for defense.
Yes.
And that takes a lot of mobilization of resources to do that. And it takes political will and ability to collaborate. So those are going to be very important.
When I interviewed President Putin back in 2021, one of the most recent stories was...
that was before, that was not
prior to the invasion.
And that was prior to...
October 2021.
Oh, but it was during COVID, that's right.
Yes, on the tail end of COVID.
That was your 2 weeks in...
yes, sir, and in Moscow. One of the big stories at that time was how his energy infrastructure was supposedly crumbling because it was melting, because so much of it was based up in the Arctic that it was crumbling, it was melting, the infrastructure needed to be rebuilt. How much of President Putin's energy infrastructure is at risk in your mind in the far north, given the fact that it hasn't been serviced by Western energy companies in these years? And also Greenland. What happens there? Because the question that I've had for the last several years now has been one of defense, security, the story that nobody's talking about until Donald Trump brought it up. But it's also a question of energy.
Well, I think I don't have a clear answer on the Arctic. I don't know what current information there is on it. Obviously, you need to continue you have a natural 3% decline in energy or 4% every year, so you have to keep investing. And it's one of the questions, have they kept it and have they had the resources to do that? We don't know that. Yeah. And so we don't know what the state of the industry. They have a partner who has a lot of capital and has a lot of technical skills, and it's called China. And so, they may have wanted to have China standoffish, but no more. And, and China is a very tough negotiator in terms of on energy, yes, as they've found again and again, including on previous and new pipelines for natural gas to China from Russia. In terms of Greenland, we're just going to see how that has to play out. And, both Denmark and the United States are members of NATO. So
For
now, obviously, one of Vladimir Putin's great dreams is to shatter NATO, and as well as establish a Russian sphere of influence and establish Russia as a great power on the world. And certainly for him, the divisions between transatlantic unity is something that he's always disliked. I mean, he has a great sense of kind of not retribution, but resentment about the way the Soviet Union collapsed, and that seems to become his leitmotif. And so invading Ukraine, he really severed his economic relations with the West. Now we'll see what kind of settlement happens in Ukraine and on what basis it happens. But
you're not anticipating that happens
well,
quickly.
I just say it's volatile. I mean, Donald Trump is determined to do it, and he'll use all of the muscle and tools for, what he said the other day about how angry he was with Putin. This is, he sees this as the great deal, and he sees himself as the great deal maker. And so he'll use all the tools of deal making that he's developed over his whole career to try and get it there.
How do you anticipate this will play out, in the sense that there's the big question about supply and demand, what global growth will look like after the announcement of tariffs, versus
that is the really big question.
Yeah, versus what's actually happening in the market with regards to Iran or with regards to Russia. How do you see this evolving?
Well, that's such a big question. I mean, we'll have to see. The answer on tariffs will not be evident in a day or a week or a month. I mean, there'll be obviously reactions in financial markets, but it will really be what happens over 6 months, what happens over a year, what kind of investment is made in the United States, factories. We won't see the answer on the tariffs in a week or a month or 6 months. It'll really unfold over a period of time, I think. But when we do see investment coming into factories, and there is so much announcements, I might mention, if you watch American television, see all these companies, whether they're U.S. companies or foreign companies that have production in the United States, all doing these ads about how many employees they have. We have 100,000 American employees, et cetera, and suppliers. But the factories that will be built, I mean, this is an age of robotics. They're not going to be...
They're not bringing jobs.
Yeah, they're not in this same way. This is not going to take us back to Detroit or Cleveland or Youngstown, Ohio, a steel town of the 1960s. These are going to be different type of factories. And one of the questions we'll see is the labor force, the skill force that's there to do it, to implement it. So a lot is being announced, and the president wants a lot to be announced. So, $100 billion, $500 billion, $1 trillion, they want to do that. And I've heard the Secretary of Commerce say what we want to do is build a tariff wall around the United States. And kind of going back to the years of William McKinley at the end of the 19th century, which was a very complicated time because you had a couple of major financial panics at the same time. So, what we're seeing, Hadley, is a reversal of a 8 or 9 decade trend that began in 1934 under Franklin Roosevelt to saying that open markets will lead to a better economy, and not to what you had in the Great Depression, to a view that, as the administration sees it, the United States has been taken advantage, even though, of course, the United States has been doing better than any of the other industrial nations. And so we're at a great turn in history.
No doubt an inflection point.
Yeah.
Tell me, from the breadth of your experience, have we been here before in this way?
If you think about turning points, I think one turning point was in the late 1940s when it was recognized that Europe was in really bad shape and the Soviet Union was going to expand. And you had this initiative called the Marshall Plan, which was the origin, by the way, US-led, of the European Union, was led by the United States. I think that was a huge turning point when you really created the beginning of the post-war world order. You had that, then a year or two later you had NATO, and that was kind of the foundation of this rules-based international order that is now in reverse or under
Crumbling.
great pressure. We'll see, but it's one that delivered immense benefits in terms of economic growth around the world, and we'll see if where this new path leads. But it is as you called it, is an inflection point, and it's being led in a very determined way by the new administration. So now the Biden administration was also rather protectionist.
Yes.
So it wasn't like, this all started yesterday.
IRA.
Yeah. Well, the IRA and tariffs, and famously Joe Biden did not invite Tesla and Elon Musk to the electric vehicle summit at the White House in August of 2021, allegedly because it was not a union shop.
Yes.
And so protectionism is not new, but and I think what's made it a great fuel of it now is also it's tied into China. Yeah. And the tension with China and the view of China, which is so different than it was in this country from what it was 15 years ago.
No doubt. And China today, I mean, we talk about supply and demand. Coming into this year, there was the big story, not just about artificial intelligence and what that's going to mean for the energy transition, but also about the state of China's economy. How do you gauge that today?
Well, I think the general view is that the Chinese economy does not have the dynamism it did have, that market forces are sort of in check and waiting to see how the government stimulates the economy.
Which they've so far failed to do.
Yeah, so far not on the scale. They've talked about it, but not on the scale, and the kind of chronic questions about consumer demand. And, even the Biden administration was talking about kind of China's, I forgot the term, but over-exporting, exporting their surplus. So trade tensions are even beyond the Trump administration, trade tensions are rising. The Germans, well, you can let in Chinese electric cars and they'll be cheap, but you will ruin your domestic automobile industry, which is, the engine of your economy. So those kind of trade-offs exist right now.
What about AI?
Well, AI is, of course, it's not new, but it's become very new. It's very important for the energy industry. It's changed the relationship. You have this tech industry kind of getting together with an energy industry. They have entirely different time frames.
Entire different outlooks, in a sense.
Yeah, outlooks. But, we'll see, it's just the AI I use is getting more and more conversational.
Yes.
And everybody says it's transformative, just don't quite know what it's going to transform. But
how are we going to fuel it?
Well, I think we're going to use a lot more natural gas to do it. I think nuclear will, some countries like, the UAE is in good position because it has significant nuclear capacity. I think nuclear comes back, but not in this decade.
Does it come back in Germany?
Well, talk about people making mistakes, shutting down 25% of your electricity supply, partly because you wanted to influence an election in one particular region. A very big and costly mistake. Maybe that will be the last place it comes back. Where small modular reactors, probably in the 2030s, we'll see them. There's so many people working on nuclear, and you're seeing big tech is investing in nuclear. So and venture capital is there, and at least there's. At CERAWeek, at our conference in Houston, we had the governor of Virginia and the head of this fusion company and the state's utilities saying, by 2032, we think we will have a significant, they don't call it a fusion reactor, they call it a fusion machine up and running. So
just all a difference of language.
Yeah, it's difference of language.
Much more palatable.
Yes. So, but I think this is a really big deal for the energy industry. Of course, there'll be an incentive for those in the data center business and the chip business to seek to become more efficient, but the scale looks like it's going to be enormous, and that's, as I say, part of the reason that we really are being forced to rethink the energy transition.
Dan Yergin, it's wonderful to have you on Al Arabiya. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you again. Thank you.